Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to everyone. What I'm going to talk about today is the plan is to undertake a genuine progress indicator study of South Asian countries, all 8 South Asian countries, and to produce some reports which would be made available to the public, but also aid policymakers to bring about and design policies that would better increase the economic welfare, sustainable economic welfare of South Asian countries. Now, this genuine progress indicator, I'll talk about it fairly soon. It's an alternative to gross domestic product. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is generally used as an indicator of genuine progress. And I'm going to start by talking about why GDP is a poor measure of well-being. Basically, GDP is just nothing more than a monetary measure of all the goods and services produced within a country. So it's effectively just a monetary index of production, nothing more, nothing less, okay? For good or for bad. It's generally believed that when GDP increases, economic welfare increases. So that's the general viewpoint. But of course, this is not always the case. And just to give you some good examples, firstly, GDP increases whenever action is taken to clean up pollution and other forms of environmental damage. So when there's environmental damage caused by some form of economic activity, other activities that clean up that mess are actually counted as a benefit when, of course, they're truly a cost. So at best, these activities are welfare maintaining, not welfare increasing. GDP increases when natural resources are depleted. Hence, many ecologically unsustainable economic activities boost GDP. But as we'll soon see, it lowers the genuine progress indicator, the GPI. So the whole idea of the GPI is to capture these environmental costs, whereas they lead to an increase in GDP, they lead to a lower genuine progress indicator value. GDP goes up when the rate of workplace and automobile accidents rises. So if you want to increase GDP, if you drove today, you could just drive your car into a brick wall and have the car repaired, and it will increase GDP. Of course, the resources that are used to repair a car are in fact costs, and those costs are not included in the GPI, even though they're included in the GDP. GDP ignores the social costs of increasing unemployment, growing income inequality and rising crime rates. In fact, an increase in crime, putting more people in jail, boosts GDP. But with the GPI, the cost of crime is subtracted. It's counted as a cost, a welfare cost. GDP also ignores many informal benefits, such as unpaid household labour and the shadow or informal economy. So, whilst the GDP counts many costs as benefits, it ignores many benefits. It doesn't capture the value, the services, the goods and services that are generated from unpaid household work, and those goods and services generated within the shadow or informal economy. The GPI picks up those values. So there's been a lot of criticism of the GPI and the fact that it includes a lot of cost items, okay, as if it's been deliberately designed to look bad, to make the situation look bad. Well, in actual fact, the GPI includes the value of unpaid household labour, volunteer labour, and the shadow economy. Okay. And that is very, very large. It's a very, very large value, positive value, which is added, which is not picked up in the measurement of GDP. So GDP clearly is an inadequate indicator of economic well-being, of genuine progress. If you want an indicator of production, fine, use a GDP. But that's all it is. It just tells you how much you are producing. If GDP goes up, it basically means that you're producing more. But it doesn't tell you why those activities which have led to increased production have taken place, what the purpose of those activities are, and the reason for those activities taking place. If they are the consequence of environmental damage and cleaning up environmental damage, they are costs, they are not benefits. Okay, so the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, is an alternative to GDP, and it's designed to overcome the inability of GDP to serve as an adequate indicator of genuine progress. The GPI is a revolutionary measure of the net benefits of economic activity. It is a macroeconomic indicator of human well-being. So by net benefits, when you want to measure net benefits, you measure the benefits, you measure the costs, you subtract the cost from the benefits, and it gives you a measure of net benefits. GDP counts everything as a benefit, even if it's a cost. Unlike GDP, the calculation of the GPI involves adding up the major benefits of economic activity and subtracting the major costs. And by benefits and costs, I'm not just talking about economic benefits and costs. I'm talking about benefits and costs of the social and environmental variety. So the GPI includes social costs and environmental costs, not just economic values. You might ask the question, is there much substance to the GPI? Is it highly recognised and respected as an index? The GPI is widely recognised, or is a widely recognised alternative indicator of economic welfare and human well-being. It's being increasingly accepted by academics, politicians and bureaucrats. So it's not something that someone has made up that is of no value, that's not being respected, not being taken into account by important members of the community. Theoretical and empirical papers on the GPI have been published in many academic journals, including Ecological Economics, which is a high quality and well-respected journal with high impact value. Okay, so it's not just something that sits over there in some space that doesn't have any great value. It is widely recognised by a lot of people, and papers on the GPI are now being published in highly respected academic journals. So what's included in the GPI? The GPI is made up of a series of benefit and cost items, which are almost separate indicators in themselves. For the purpose of my presentation today, I'm just going to go through some of the benefit and cost items that are included. The base item of the GPI is are consumption benefits. Okay, now consumption can lead to problems, but they're picked up in cost items. The consumption itself generates benefits. So it starts with consumption benefits, and you can see beside consumption benefits I've got a plus sign, so it's added. Of course, the distribution of income is important when it comes to consumption. What we have found is that the extra benefit, or the benefit of extra consumption for a poor person is greater than it is for a rich person. So if a rich person is already consuming a lot of goods and services, an increase in the goods and services they consume doesn't add much to their well-being. But for a poor person, if you increase the amount of, or the quantity of goods and services they consume, even by a small amount, it has a large positive impact on their well-being. Now, who gets to consume what depends upon the distribution of income. So income distribution is used to weight the consumption benefits. What that means, and of course I've got a plus and minus sign there. So what that means is, if the distribution of income becomes more equal, the consumption benefits are weighted upwards. If it becomes less equal, they're weighted downwards. The GPI also includes services from infrastructure, and by that I mean roads, schools and hospitals, services from unpaid household labour, which I've already talked about, and services delivered by the shadow or informal economy, which is particularly important for low GDP countries. So for wealthy countries, the shadow economy is not so large, but for poorer countries it is. GDP ignores that, the GPI doesn't. There's an international dimension, and that is that the GPI includes changes in foreign debt, which can be plus or negative. So if foreign debt increases, that's a negative. If it falls, it's a positive. Then there's a range of social costs, the cost of unemployment, the cost of crime. Then we have a series of environmental costs, which are subtracted in calculating the GPI. And they include the cost of non-renewable resource depletion, so that's minerals that are depleted as a consequence of economic activity, cost of deforestation, cost of land degradation, which is soil loss, soil erosion, cost of excessive water use and industrial wastewater pollution, cost of air pollution, and cost of CO2 emissions. So as you can see, the GPI includes economic, social and environmental factors, not just benefits but also costs, and counts the costs as a negative item, unlike GDP. What does the calculation of the GPI involve? In fact, I've got some documents here that I might just circulate. This one in particular at this stage. If you want to know what's involved in calculating in calculating the GPI. Actually, perhaps before I do, I'll just show this on the camera, and then that can be seen. If you want to know what's involved in calculating the GPI, that's what's involved. Spreadsheets that thick, 100 pages, just to produce the genuine progress indicator for one country. All right, so it's a mammoth task.
Shall I just pass around?
Yes. No, leave the clip on.
Okay.
Leave the clip on. So you can please leave the clip on. Yeah. To calculate the GPI for a range of countries, so if we're talking about South Asian countries or any region of the world, you need a consistent data set. And for the purpose of this study, I'm utilising a World Bank data set, which is data that's highly respected. The calculation of the GPI is not a simple process, as you will no doubt see as I circulate this particular document. My recent calculation of the GPI for 6 countries involves the creation of 100 pages of spreadsheets, which include, well, there's a master spreadsheet to record the values of each GPI item. There is a spreadsheet for every item. So of those items I listed, there's a spreadsheet for those items. And they feed into a master spreadsheet to calculate the genuine progress indicator. Just to give you some idea of the size of some of these spreadsheets, just one of those items that I listed involves a 3 by 7 page spreadsheet, 21 pages. 3 pages down, 7 across. And equations are embodied in the spreadsheets and links between them to incorporate all sheets into the master spreadsheet. And as I've got there, I'm just circulating that document at the moment so you get some sort of an idea of what's involved in order to calculate the GPI. Okay, so what are going to be the aims of this project, this South Asian GPI project? How might the project benefit South Asia and South Asian countries? Well, the aims of the project are firstly to calculate the genuine progress indicator for each South Asian nation, to calculate the GPI for the entire South Asia region, so you can do a regional one, GPI, to compare the GPIs of each country. Right, so once you've calculated the GPI of each country, you can compare the GPIs of each country and facilitate comparisons between national GPIs and the regional GPI. Now that's useful because we not only want to look at the genuine progress indicators of each country, but the regional GPI will effectively be the average GPI for the region. And therefore you can see whether a country's GPI is above or below the regional GPI. To help policymakers design policies to deliver genuine progress in the South Asia region. So one of the major purposes of this exercise is that it provides a lot of data that can be used to inform policymakers to design better policies to bring about genuine progress in any part of the world, but in this particular case, the South Asia region. To produce reports, GPI reports, on each South Asian country and the South Asia region as a whole, and to make these reports accessible to the public, so they will eventually become accessible to the public. Additional aims of the project: to present the GPI results at a major international conference to give the project high exposure, and I will probably presenting these results at some point in the future at the International Society for Ecological Economics. To undertake a speaking tour of South Asian countries to highlight the GPI results and explain their significance. To produce a series of academic papers, so a number of academic papers should emerge from this particular study, and ultimately to produce a book documenting genuine progress in South Asia. So overall, the project, the GPI project, would serve as a landmark study for the South Asia region and for GPI studies outside of Europe and North America, which is where most of the GPI studies have been conducted in the past. Okay? No GPI study has been conducted of South Asia. Now, just to give you some idea of what the GPI involves, I know I'm circulating that document, but I'll talk a bit about a GPI study that I completed fairly recently and talk about what the information can provide for policymakers and what it can say in terms of the genuine progress of a particular either nation or, in some cases, as is the case here, a state or a province. So I recently conducted a GPI study for South Australia for the previous state government. That was late last year. I was asked, commissioned by the then South Australian government, of course we had a change in the state government, to produce a GPI study for South Australia. And I wrote a very brief report on the GPI results and their significance. And of course that's another document I have here that can be circulated. Do you want me to just... This is the... just have a look at the flick through that, Darren. So it was done in relative hurry. It took about 3 months to do. It's only a very short report, the GPI report for South Australia, but it gives you some insight into what I'm about to say in my presentation. Now, the work involved calculating the GPI for Australia and South Australia. So I didn't just calculate it for South Australia, but also for Australia. And the reason why I did that was that I subtracted the values for South Australia from the Australian values to obtain a GPI measure for the rest of Australia. So if you could imagine, Australia is made up of a number of states, just imagine that Australia is made up of 2 states, South Australia and the rest, called rest of Australia. Okay, we wanted to make a comparison between South Australia and rest of Australia. Now that's not a comparison between South Australia and other individual states, but the rest collectively. Then we could compare the South Australia's per capita GPI with its per capita gross state product, GSP, as well as South Australia's per capita GPI with that of rest of Australia. Now, I've talked about the deficiencies of GDP, gross domestic product. Now I'm talking about gross state product. GDP is the standard measure of national income at the national level, GDP. Gross state product is an identical measure at the state or provincial level. And some countries got states and some countries call them provinces. The results indicated that the per capita GPIs of South Australia and Australia were much lower than their per capita GSP, GDP values, suggesting that per capita GSP or GDP were overstating genuine progress in South Australia and Australia. So just to give you some insight, I've got here, this is the per capita GSP for South Australia, that's the blue line, and the red line is South Australia's per capita GPI. And you can see it's much lower. And it's not increasing at the same rate. My other diagram I've got here, now that's the red line is South Australia's per capita GPI. The blue line is the per capita genuine progress indicator for the rest of Australia. And what it shows is that around about the mid-1990s, South Australia, which previously had a per capita GPI lower than that of the rest of Australia, in fact, was much higher and remained higher from about 1997 through to the end of the study period here, which is 2016. Now that's despite the fact that South Australia's gross state product is less than most other states within Australia. Okay? So conventional view would be that South Australia is doing poorly compared to the rest of Australia because it's got a lower per capita GSP. But in fact, the GPI indicates that South Australia is doing better than a place called rest of Australia. I think I'm at yes, just to point out, South Australia's per capita GPI increased. So the study period was 1986 to 2016. South Australia's per capita GPI increased by 15% over that period. However, that was half the percentage increase in per capita GDP, or GSP, over the same period. So, as I've pointed out, despite South Australia having a lower per capita GSP and a smaller rate of increase in per capita GSP than the rest of Australia, it had a larger per capita GPI, suggesting South Australia is experiencing a greater rate of genuine progress than the rest of Australia, which cannot be concluded from measures of gross state product. Now, the individual values of the individual GPI items could help. So the spreadsheets have various values for the different items that make up the GPI, and they can be used to explain why, in this case, South Australia appears to have made greater genuine progress than the rest of Australia. So this is just to give you some idea of how the information generated by doing a GPI study can aid policymakers. Not just for South Australia, but would be a similar case for South Asian countries. The data showed that South Australia has a more even distribution of income than the rest of Australia, which magnifies the consumption benefits in South Australia relative to the rest of Australia. South Australia has a lower cost of living than the rest of Australia, especially housing costs. South Australia has lower per capita environmental costs than the rest of Australia. And that was due to a number of factors: lower rates of native vegetation clearance. In fact, in South Australia, native vegetation clearance is virtually zero. A piece of legislation was enacted about 35 years ago which prohibits the clearance of native vegetation. There's still significant native vegetation clearance in some states in Australia, in particular Queensland and parts of New South Wales and some in West Australia. South Australia uses irrigation water far more efficiently. South Australia relies very heavily upon the River Murray for irrigation water. South Australia is down the bottom end of that river, okay, and as a consequence it has to use the water more efficiently, and it does. South Australia has lower levels of per capita energy use and greenhouse gas emissions than the rest of Australia. And South Australia relies less heavily on non-renewable resource depletion, and by that I mean mining, to finance its consumption. So if you look at states like West Australia and Queensland, one of the main activities that finances its consumption, which is a benefit item, is a negative item, and that's mining, the depletion of non-renewable resources. That's not the case for South Australia. And the reason for that was that one of the other great benefits for South Australia revealed by the GPI study was that the percentage of South Australia's GSP generated from value-adding activities, in other words manufacturing, is much higher than most Australian states. Okay, so South Australia is in effect one of Australia's main manufacturing states, which means it's adding value to real resources, to natural resources, rather than exploiting natural resources to generate income in order to finance consumption. So this means that South Australia is better adept at adding value to resources rather than supplying resources for other states or nations to add value to them, to those resources. From a policy point of view, the study showed that South Australia could widen its advantage over the rest of Australia by doing a number of things. Firstly, exploiting its manufacturing edge to attract and establish high-grade forms of manufacturing. Right, so it has the capacity to attract those high-grade, value-adding forms of manufacturing, given its strong manufacturing base. And continuing its strong transition towards renewable energy sources, South Australia has the highest percentage of renewable resource energy or electricity generation as a percentage of total electricity generation of any state in Australia, which would further reduce environmental costs and attract new forms of investment into the state. And the study also indicated that large-scale resource depleting projects, which have been suggested in the past, such as expansion in mining and oil drilling in the Great Australian Bight. There's a plan to, in fact, explore for oil reserves in the Great Australian Bight, which is a major aquatic reserve for not only most forms of fisheries, but also for whales, the southern right-backed whale, and so forth. It's basically a pristine coastline. These sorts of activities, mining and oil drilling in the Great Australian Bight, would be unlikely to significantly increase South Australia's economic welfare. Just one other GPI study I want to talk about. I've been recently commissioned to conduct a GPI study of Saudi Arabia for an organisation called the Bin Zaga Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And this study provided a wonderful opportunity to assess the genuine progress of a nation that has two major features: has a very unequal distribution of income and relies heavily on the exploitation of a non-renewable resource. What the study showed was that in 2016, Saudi Arabia's per capita GPI was considerably lower than its per capita GDP. So in actual fact, in terms of international dollars, which is a fictitious monetary measurement based on purchasing power parity of individual countries. Saudi Arabia's per capita GPI was 17,000 international dollars per person, despite its GDP being $50,000 per person. So the per capita GDP is 3 times its per capita GPI. So obviously per capita GDP in the case of Saudi Arabia greatly overestimates the genuine progress being achieved in Saudi Arabia. And just to give you some idea of what the diagram looks like for Saudi Arabia, that's for the period 1970 to 2016. Now, the reason for the huge spike, the red line is per capita GDP and the blue line is per capita GPI. And the reason for the huge spike, that was during the 1970s when there was the huge increase in oil prices, which of course boosted the GDP, per capita GDP of Saudi Arabia. It did have a positive effect on the GPI, per capita GPI of Saudi Arabia, but not nearly as much as it did for per capita GDP. You can see throughout the period, the per capita GPI for Saudi Arabia is much less than per capita GDP. And whilst the per capita GDP in the last 20 years or so has basically levelled off, you can see for most of the last 20 years in Saudi Arabia, 20, 25 years, the per capita GPI has fallen. And that's basically it. The aim is to do something similar for South Asian nations. It provides, as you can see, lots of information given what I described and explained with regards to the South Australian GPI study, which can be used by policymakers to design policies that can bring about greater genuine progress within a state, a nation or region. And you can do that because you can identify, because you've got different benefit and cost items, you can identify which items are having the greatest positive effect on the GPI and those which are having the greatest negative effect. You can also, by looking at the data, for example, I mentioned with South Australia that large-scale resource depleting projects, for example mining or drilling for oil in the Great Australian Bight, would not significantly increase South Australia's economic welfare. Why? Well, it might lead to some consumption benefits, but it would also lead to an increase in the cost of non-renewable resource depletion. So one item would go up, the other one would go down, and they'd offset each other, the GPI wouldn't rise. So other forms of activity need to be conducted in South Australia to boost the GPI. An opportunity does exist in South Australia for that, value adding of resources, so not using too many resources but adding value to those resources because of South Australia's strong manufacturing base. That can be gleaned from the information that's generated by calculating the GPI. Can't be gleaned from GDP because if South Australia goes ahead and engages in large-scale mining projects or drilling of oil off the Great Australian Bight, South Australia's GSP will go up, giving the impression that South Australia is better off, where the GPI will indicate that there will be some benefits, but there will be some costs. And overall, South Australia's economic welfare would not rise.